Hi, this is Master Viktor Neustroyev. Chess becomes popular all over the world, and many people would like to learn to play chess, and they even consider this game as the game that reflects their intellectual abilities. And it's very often when beginners face with difficulties trying to play chess, because they just don't know how to play strategically, and they are looking of how to improve in chess. What you should know about chess when you start playing this game. Chess is not only checks, attacks, and captures. You have to be creative and create your own strategical plans that help to improve your position in general or just in a certain part of the board. Of course, it takes much time to learn strategy yourself. You'd better follow basic guidelines that were already formed and proved by millions of chess players. If you're a beginner or just want to improve your ability to play strategically, watch this video about top 7 chess strategy tips for beginners.
Tip number 1. Occupy the center with your pawns. Move the pawn in front of either the king or queen, 2 squares forward, and if your opponent allows you to get 2 pawns in the center, do it. Occupy 2 squares. The player who controls the center usually dominates in the game, has more space, and as the result interacts with his pieces much better. For example, knight f6, here you totally dominate the center, you then develop your pieces, and for example, in some of my games happens something like that. Knight bd7, castle, castle, and because here white has the center, he can play e5 and chase the knight. In the game it was d takes e5, d takes e5, and knight e8, which is a really bad move. Then e6, now if he takes, then I take with my bishop, it ruins his pawn structure. But instead of taking with the bishop, knight g5 can be played as well, and nothing can stop white from taking on e6. So in this example, white dominated, white controlled the center, and finally was able to apply a tactical strike and give a fork and gain the exchange. So you see, this knight on d7 can't really move. If it moves, the queen is hanging. If your opponent doesn't allow you to occupy the center with the second pawn, he plays, for example, something like that and controls the d4 square, so you can't move the pawn without a trade. Just play knight f3, start develop your pieces. Something like that. Tip number 2. Develop your minor pieces. After you occupy the center with at least one pawn, develop your minor pieces. You shouldn't only think about how to bring out your pieces from their initial positions, but also find ideal locations for these pieces. Develop your knights first and try to control the center with them, and bishops should be located on the open diagonals. Also, don't play with the same piece twice, if it's not required, of course. This is how you can lose a tempo instead of developing your other piece. For example, I can show you what can happen in one of the lines of Berlin defense. So d3, bishop c5, castle, d6, c3. So of course in this position I can play knight c3, but here this is not the ideal position for the knight because this square can be occupied with the pawn, with the idea to play then d4. So that's why I do this. Knight comes to d2, but what's the ideal square for this knight? It's g3, where it controls the f5. That's why I play a6. And then bishop retreats to b3, then a rook e1 and knight f1. So finally knight comes to g3 and then knight f5. So in a close position I can allow myself to spend a few tempers to find the ideal position for the piece. And this is what I want you to do when you play a game. So when you decide where to develop your piece, try to find the best square. Tip number 3. Don't forget to castle and remember about king safety. After you developed all of or just some of your minor pieces, don't forget to castle. When the king is castle, it's more difficult to attack it for enemy pieces. But even if you're castled early, don't forget about the king's safety and be sure that the king is safe enough. Otherwise, trade the queens or other pieces that attack your king, or just defend the king with your own pieces. I can show you an example. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, d3, bishop c5, and in this position it's okay just to castle. So you can castle early and keep these pieces undeveloped for now, develop them a little bit later on the next, or maybe the move after the next move. And another example, in this position black is attacking the g2 square with a checkmate, but it's white to move, and the best way to play is queen f3. This is how we not only protect on g2 but also attack the bishop. For example, the bishop retreats, maybe even to c8. I don't know. Let's say bishop c8. And then, because we don't want black here to make a rook lift and continue the attack, we'd better first trade the queens. After we trade the queens on g3, there will be no attack for black. At least our king is safe. Another thing that we can do in this position after bishop retreats, we can play knight e2 and then locate our knight on g3. So this is the way to defend the king with our other pieces. Tip number 4, make a game plan. It's very often when a beginner or a club player doesn't think about the plan. And you know, it is said that it's better to follow a bad plan than even play with no plan at all. And each move that you make should have the idea behind it. So if you don't know how to play in this position, there are 2 ways and 2 tips that you can follow. First, think about your worst piece and improve it. And second, figure out your opponent's plan and try to disrupt it. In this position, looks like there is nothing that white can do, so there is no certain play for white that can improve their position. What about black? It's difficult to come up with a plan, but as this position is taken from the real game between grandmasters, black found a really good solution. Black realized that this knight on c6 is a really bad piece and needs improvement, and he played knight b8. Rook d1, knight b8, with the idea to relocate this knight to d7, f6 and e4. So e4 is the ideal position for this knight. This is what happens. Knight comes to f6 and wants to go to e4. So finally knight went there. Tip number 5. Occupy open and semi-open files with your rooks. Soviet masters always said to their students, if you don't know how to play, occupy the open file with your rook. Same thing can be recommended for semi-open files. These moves sometimes look like useless moves, but later in the game you can be very thankful to your rook that controls the key file. Your rook becomes active and can penetrate into the enemy camp in the endgame, and even attack pawn weaknesses. For example, in this position a rook e1 was played. The rook was put to a semi-open file that's gonna be open soon. And black replied with d takes e4, what was probably a mistake. Knight takes e4, queen takes d1, another inaccuracy because in this position white takes on f6 and double the f pawns with a tempo. Rook takes d1, and now both rooks are activated. The pawn on c6 is hanging. The only way to protect it is to play bishop b7, and then white can play either rook e7 or rook d7 to get the control of the 7th rank and attack pawn weaknesses. Rook a c8, in this position maybe just bishop g4 is enough to chase the rook, but in that game it was rook d to d7, attacking the pawn on c7, and in this position white totally dominates. As a result, white won that game. Now tip number 6. Activate your king in the endgame. When it comes to the endgame, there is no need to keep your king safe. Usually there is not enough enemy pieces on the board to checkmate your king. However, if you centralize the king and use it as the normal piece that can attack the squares around it, it can be very helpful for your position. For example, here white is 1 pawn up, and Black plan was to play rook d8 and to attack the pawn on d4 that cannot be protected with any pieces except the king. But white king was close to the center, and with king e3 move, white can successfully protect the d4 pawn and then attack the weakness on c6 with his rook using the semi-open file. Later play e5 and create a passed pawn. This is a winning plan for white in this position. Because of the king standing in the center, white wins the game successfully. Tip number 7, the last one. Support or attack passed pawns from behind with your rook. For example, look at this position. We have a passed pawn on b7 and we support it from behind. So what do we need to promote it? Just to get rid of this rook. How can we get rid of this rook? I actually think that a king maneuver might help in this position, but in this exact position there is a much faster way to succeed. So we just play knight c6 with the idea to attack the rook. And if now he takes, we can attack the rook with our c7 pawn and then promote the b pawn. Same thing works for the enemy passed pawn. Always attack enemy passed pawn from behind. So in this position, white can't really do anything. If he moves the rook, he loses on e7. He may try to play with his king, but we just keep our king on h7 and g7. And when he comes closer to our rook, just keep the rook on the a file. He comes closer again, and then we go back to the first rank with the idea to check the enemy king from behind. This is how we check and repeat the position, giving a perpetual check. Finally, when he is far from the a7 pawn and still can't move the rook to the other file, we play rook a1. Now, if he comes closer, we repeat the position with checks or just maybe king's moves. If he plays with his rook, he loses on a7. That's a draw. If our rook was located somewhere else, we could lose this game. But because of its ideal position where the rook is quite active, it's a draw.
In this video, you learned top 7 chess strategy tips for beginners, and I'm sure if you follow these guidelines, you will improve your chess performance and become a better strategic player, and maybe even a better decision maker. However, if you are a person who never stops at what has been accomplished so far, I recommend you to continue your learning process and watch the video on the screen next about top aggressive openings to be able to get initiative in your games from the first moves. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it with your friends, chess players. Now, watch the video on the screen next to learn top 7 aggressive chess openings, and I will see you there in a moment.